Hello, folks. This is David Villar, and welcome to this presentation on toxic range plants. The idea of this presentation is to introduce some basic concepts to plant intoxications. We all know that herbivores feed on plants and therefore are susceptible to suffer from ingesting some toxic ones. There are certain plants that should never be ingested because they are highly toxic, either acutely or with chronic ingestions that can cause a prolonged disease state. But as we will see, there are other plants that have a high nutritional value and are a good forage, but they can also be toxic under certain conditions, which we are going to see depend on the animal, the plant, or some environmental factors. So these are the different things that we're going to elaborate on this presentation, starting with the basis for making a diagnosis of plant intoxications. Next, we will see what drives a herbivore to ingest one type of plant or another when they're free ranging, grazing on pastures. And finally, we will discuss what are factors that predispose to have plant intoxications. And as I mentioned, and as I just mentioned, depend on the animal, plant, or the environment. So how do we know whether an animal has been poisoned by a toxic plant? Well, the first thing is to say that in most cases the clinical signs are going to be non-specific and they can resemble many other diseases. In those cases, what we can do is to identify the toxic plant in the animal environment, walk around the pasture to see if there is any evidence of consumption, and then to see if the clinical presentation matches what would be expected by the way that plant causes toxicosis. As I say, in most cases it is quite difficult, but then again we have other exceptions in which it may be quite straightforward to diagnose. And I'm thinking of plants like Japanese yew or oleander that kill the animal from one day to the next. And if you find it in the rumen, that's all you need to reach or make a diagnosis. So the intoxication by plants also follow the principles of toxicology, that the dose makes the poison. And I would add that the time frame in which that dose is reached in the animal is critical. For example, there can be toxic plants that when they are ingested in large quantities in a short time, they can reach toxic levels. But those same plants, if they're ingested slowly, one bite at a time, so to speak, another one a few hours later, that gives the animal time to eliminate the toxin from the body. And a good example of this would be nitrates that we will address in a separate video. How can we predict whether a herbivore will ingest a toxic plant? Well, to a large extent, it's going to depend on the previous experience with that plant. A good analogy would be when we touch a plant with thorns. It's going to hurt, and you are going to remember to stay away from touching that plant again. So in simple words, if the animal feels sick shortly after ingesting that plant, it's likely that he will avoid ingesting it in the near future. And this is what's called aversion. There are actually some experiments which are not shown on this slide in which they feed a particular plant and immediately they give the animal an emetic drug like lithium chloride or apomorphine, which is going to make them feel sick with nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and that's going to create aversion to that plant. So on this slide, when we when the animal encounters a plant for the first time, uh, the first thing will be to see if it smells good or bad. The next thing the animal will do is to eat and taste that plant, and if it feels sick, as I just mentioned, within the next few hours, it is going to create what's called a negative digestive feedback that in which that flavor becomes distasteful, and when the animal encounters the plant in the future, he will reject ingesting that plant. Now, how long does the aversion last? Well, that's going to depend on the previous cognitive processes that include behavior of peers. That's called social facilitation. Also any other previous experience he may have had with that plant, and obviously their inquisitive nature to sample plants. Now, what we see on this slide is that aversion is not always all or nothing. There is a lot of in between, if you like. So when animals are grazing on free range, they usually eat different plants at the same time. So this is going to make it difficult to relate any particular plant with a positive or negative feedback. For example, you can favor the consumption of a toxic plant if it is followed by a good nutritional plant right afterwards, like for example corn silage or Sudan grass or ryegrass, whatever. Now from here onwards, let's see what are the factors that predispose herbivores to develop intoxication by plants. So we're going to discuss conditions that are going to depend on the animal, the environment, and the plant. And in order for the intoxications to take place, we need basically a susceptible animal, the ingestion of the plant or part of the plant parts that have enough of a toxin, and finally an environment or management practice that favors the animal to ingest enough quantity of the plant to intoxicate the animal. So if we start by talking about factors that depend on the plant, the phenological stage may be critical because the amount of the toxin can vary a lot depending on its stage of development. On the next slide, we're going to see a classical example, which is tall larkspur. The range side or soil nutrients. A good example would be plants that accumulate selenium in soils that are high in selenium, obviously, or for example, plants that are prone to accumulate nitrates, in which case, for example, fertilizers can prone those plants to build up toxic levels of nitrates. Now, the weather can also play a very important role. For example, droughts can compromise the growth and photosynthesis of plants, making them more likely to accumulate nitrates. Also, the environment, if there is a stress, it can favor the growth of molds that produce mycotoxins on the field or after harvesting those crops for forage. There can be certain toxic weeds that are the only green plants available during some months of the year, and I'm thinking of Japanese yew in the Midwest. Finally, the amount of toxins is going to be distributed differently between different parts of the plant. It can be very high in fruits, like for example with nightshade, or it can be higher in leaves or stems, like nitrate in corn or Sudan grass. So an example of toxicity depending on the growth stage of the plant, as I just mentioned, is tall larkspur. This is a plant that has a very high protein content and makes it a good plant from a nutritional point of view. An adaptation, for example, with wild herbivores is that they consume it for 1 or 2 days, and then they are going to avoid eating it in subsequent days to allow the toxin to be eliminated. This was called cyclic consumption. On this graph, what we see is that the toxicity is higher in the vegetative or bud stages, but is poorly palatable or attractive in these early stages. When the plant is mature, as for example, when we see flowers and fruits, the toxicity is lower, but it is more palatable at this particular stage of the plant. So as you can see, the window period is in between actually, and that is when we need to prevent livestock from consuming the plant. Now, another way to prevent the animal from ingesting this plant would be to induce aversion with, for example, lithium chloride right after they ingest the plant. And as we can see here, there is a very low risk of grazing when the plant is growing, and also there is low risk in the late season when the plant is mature. Now let's look at another example of one of the most common forage species throughout the southern U.S., which is tall fescue. In this particular case, the toxins are produced by an endophyte. This is actually a mold or fungus that is within the leaves, the stems, and the seeds of this plant species. This fungus has a symbiotic relationship with the host plant, actually, and the alkaloids help the plant protect it from droughts, heats, and also some plant-eating insects. Now, the reason I bring this one up is because there are some varieties of tall fescue that are free of the endophyte, and therefore they are not toxic to cattle or horses. But as I just mentioned, the problem is that they are not as resilient to adverse weather conditions. So this is another example in which the toxicity depends on whether the plant contains the toxin or is devoid of the toxin. Ergovaline is the alkaloid or the main toxin, and it's similar to that of ergot fungus, which actually caused widespread human poisonings in medieval times when the cereal grains were infected and then harvested and consumed by people. Now on this other slide here, we see a list of the problems that tall fescue creates in cattle. As you can see, fescue foot, fat necrosis, and fescue toxicity, with a list of things that account for fescue toxicity. And as you can see, there is a group of cattle spending the daylight hours in a pond, basically to counteract the lack of cooling off which this toxin produces. Now, if we talk about the animal factors that predispose them to ingest toxic plants, the number one, by far and away, would be to have hungry animals with nothing better to eat. Basically, it takes away their will to select plant species that are beneficial, and they would find more palatable and nutritious. Naive animals introduced into a new pastures will be more prone to ingest novel plants to which they're not accustomed to eat. And there are toxins like nitrates or oxalates to which they develop tolerance when they ingest them every day. And this is the reason why there is no specific level of nitrates that will kill cattle. Now they are a lot more susceptible to become intoxicated if their diet in the previous days had no or little nitrates or oxalates in them. Now, young animals also tend to be more susceptible because they have not really learned to avoid poisonous plants. And for example, for those plants that cause abortion or teratogenic effects, it's obviously that the animal needs to be pregnant. Now here we have an example of plants that cause teratogenic effects: poison hemlock, certain lupine species, tobacco plants. In this slide we see a calf with arthrogryposis, and this happens when the pregnant cow eats this type of plants during the period in which the legs are being developed. With regards to the factors that are dependent on the environment, we can mention overgrazing, to the point that the only plants remaining in the pasture are toxic. It can also happen that very toxic weeds are contaminating a forage crop, which will be harvested and offered as hay, for example, on a feed bank or trough. And finally, the climate and management practices could also favor the presence of certain toxins. On this slide, we see plants that are very toxic, like certain milkweeds or nightshade. And if they are harvested, if they are infesting a field which is harvested, there may be some batches or bales of hay with these plants that could become lethal to cattle. Now, on this other slide, we see a pasture that has been totally overtaken by Senecio plants. These are commonly known as rugwort. And if we turn animals into that field, we don't really give them any options but to ingest the toxic plant. On this other slide, we see a field that has been overgrazed, and there are basically no plants left to eat. This is a pasture at the end of the year in Scotland. All the green grasses are disappearing because of the season, and the only ones standing are tansy rugwort. This is a very bitter plant. Cattle will avoid it unless there is nothing better to eat. So if you ever work as a veterinarian in the UK, you will soon learn that this is the plant that causes more intoxications in cattle and horses also. We mentioned tall fescue earlier, and we were saying that they have endophytes that produce the toxin in the plant. Here we see another type of contamination by what looks like a mouse dropping on the seed head of some cereal grains. That cereal grain could be fescue, ryegrass, barley, oat, wheat, and some other ones. And basically what you see here, those structures are called sclerotia, and it's basically a compact mass of hard fungal mycelium, which is one stage of the life cycle of some fungi. In this case is Claviceps purpurea. You may have heard of ergotism, which is the disease caused by the alkaloids produced by this type of fungi. I was referring to the weather being a major player for the presence of toxins. Well, in this case, cool and wet springs with even flooding, which is followed by early hot summers. These are prime conditions for the fungus to grow. So if we, for example, delay harvesting some of those cereal grains because of heavy rains, we may be given a chance for this fungus to grow and infest our crops. Now, this is the final slide. I wanted to show this field with the stems after corn plants have been harvested. The lower part of the plants, in this case, the stems, are the ones where nitrates tend to be at higher concentrations, particularly if we have fertilized those fields. So in the case in the case management, in this case, management could be the culprit of poisoning cattle. You definitely don't want to turn cattle into those fields, particularly if there is nothing else to eat except for those stems. This is the last slide. The idea was to introduce some basic concepts to plant intoxications, and on future videos we will address the most common type of plants that cause poisoning in livestock, their mechanism of action, as well as their clinical presentation, and how they could be treated and prevented. So thank you for watching, and until next time, bye-bye. Take care.